This happened in the fall, when my daughter was around 8 years old. It was me, my husband, and daughter, who all lived in this relatively big house. We had planned on having a larger family, and eventually we did, hence why the house was so big in the first place. This house also had an unfinished basement. You couldn't enter the basement from inside the house though. You had to go outside, and there was a door in the back of the house that led down into it. It wasn't really the best thing for storage or anything like that, especially because it was susceptible to flooding as well. So we really didn't do much with all that extra space. Shelly, my daughter, would sometimes go down into the basement though. I guess she considered it like one of those child forts or something like that. We didn't really like this, obviously, and did our best to keep her out of there. But you know how children can be sometimes. If you forbid them to do something, it just makes them want to do it even more. So, we would catch her down there sometimes. And before you worry, there was nothing down there dangerous like tools or nails or anything like that. Other than a single empty shelf, there really was nothing at all down there. One day, while I was fixing up lunch, it was summer, so school was out. Shelly came running into the house crying. I asked her what was wrong. She told me she had heard someone talking to her while she was in the basement. Apparently, the voice had told her to come out of the basement or it would come down and kill her. My next-door neighbor Janet was over, so she watched Shelly as I went to see if anyone really was down there. As I looked down and searched that basement though, there was absolutely nothing to be found. It was completely empty, so I chalked it up to just being Shelly's imagination. There was one good benefit though to what happened. Shelly was too scared to go down into the basement and didn't go down afterward for a very long time. Because of this, I put that whole incident of her hearing the voice out of my head. I had no reason to believe my daughter was in any danger now. This was months after this event. It was fall now, and Shelly was playing with Janet's son, who was around the same age as her. They were very friendly, but you know how children can be sometimes. Ben knew all about what had happened in the summertime, and he began calling Shelly a scaredy cat for what happened. Shelly did what most kids would do in that situation. She told Ben that if he was so brave, he should go down in that basement all by himself. And being a young boy, of course he decided that would be a good idea. Now, I have to mention that I did not hear any of this happening as it was going on. This is all what the kids told me afterward. If I had heard a single bit of this, I would have definitely put a stop to it right away. Anyway, where I come in, I was doing laundry or something, when I suddenly heard a scream coming from down in the basement. Completely terrified, I dropped what I was doing, sprinted outside, and noticed that the door to the basement was closed, and Ben was pounding on the door, begging for him to be let out. I simply turned the doorknob and the door opened normally. He sprinted out and ran past me over to his house. Going over to talk to Janet, Ben told us that he had gone down into the basement on a dare. He'd looked around a little bit until he heard a voice. The voice once again told him to leave the basement or it would kill him. According to Ben, he turned around and looked in the direction of that voice. Remember I told you about that one empty shelf? It was like a bookcase, sort of. He told us he'd seen a witch peeking out from behind the shelf, an old scraggly woman, and she was hiding behind it. I have to admit his description of what he saw was pretty terrifying, but neither Janet or I actually believed a witch was behind the bookshelf. We left the kids at her house with her older daughter who was 16, and we both went over to investigate the basement ourselves. We looked behind this shelf, which was about 6 inches away from the wall, and of course we didn't see anyone. No human being could fit behind there, unless they were completely emaciated. So, Janet and I both chalked it up to our kids' imagination once again. Just to be safe though, we did put a padlock on the basement door to keep them from going down there anymore. I mean, sometimes children do have a tendency to scare themselves over nothing a bit. So, within about a week later, I was doing some homework when I began hearing some noises coming from within the basement. I was a little bit confused, There was no reason any sound should be coming from there. My husband was home and he heard it too. He grabbed up his gun and told me to wait in the house. As I was waiting, I could suddenly hear the sounds of a woman screaming, and I was very shocked. I wanted to go outside, but I heard my husband yell for me to call the police. I dropped what I was doing and did just that. When the police finally got there, I watched as they led this really scraggly woman in handcuffs from my backyard to a police car. I was so confused until my husband explained to me that the woman was living in the crawl space underneath our house. The kids must have seen and heard her, and she'd hid in the space when we checked the basement out. I had never thought to check that crawl space because it was boarded off with just one trap door that was basically always closed. Well, when we had locked the door up, she had no way of getting out of the basement. I guess she needed to get out for food or something, I don't know. So when I heard all that noise, it was her trying to find a way out. My husband caught her and held her down screaming, while the police came quickly. I really didn't want to press charges against a woman who was homeless and just wanted a place to stay. But then again, she did threaten my kid and my neighbor's kid too. Fortunately, she was placed in a psychiatric hospital instead. It seems she didn't actually want to hurt anyone, but she was clearly mentally unstable and needed a place to stay as well. I grew up in a very poor and very rural family, but even though my immediate family was pretty rural, it was nothing like Papa and Mama. The parents on my mom's side of the family, they lived pretty much in a cabin or a shack that only had 2 bedrooms. A lot of grandchildren would visit them, and we all slept in their huge feather bed whenever that happened. The walls were super thin and there was basically no insulation at all in that house. This meant in the winter it was basically freezing in every room except the main one with a stove. We would huddle up in bed together covered with many various quilts. Getting to the house was a big journey in itself because they lived so far out into the hills. Eventually, you even had to take a barely maintained dirt road to get all the way there. But don't get me wrong, I know I'm sort of making it seem like a bad thing, but all us kids absolutely loved it. They had chickens and animals, and Papa was a hunter. It was a really nice and exciting time we spent out there. Now, I was about 8 years old when I had a very strange experience at their home. There were 3 of us girls and some of our cousins who were going to spend some time over at their house. This was also in the fall though, so it was not going to be too hot or cold there yet. My parents dropped us off there and didn't remain too long before they left. We liked it though, and we were prepared to have a very good time. On the 3rd night we were there, that was when the strange thing happened. It was nighttime, and we heard all of the chickens begin crying out. That was unusual for that time of the day/night. Papa went outside to check them and see what was going on. At that very moment, the dogs began howling crazily too. They were in the backyard, but they were all leashed up in their doghouses. Papa came back in the house quickly, and he was very frustrated that all of the animals were acting up, and he couldn't get them to quiet down no matter what. He grabbed something and went back into the backyard. All of us kids were now worked up as well. Some of us were scared, but one of the boys saw something in the front yard. He and the other boys ran out to investigate. Me and the kids left behind followed shortly thereafter. The driveway to the old shack was pretty long. What we were seeing was something bright out on the dirt road. We had no idea what it was. We thought it might have been a ghost or something, but rather than being scared, we moved closer and closer to it. When we got close enough to make it out, it seemed to be a glowing cow or something. Papa and Mama came out into the front yard to see what we were doing. They all saw the glowing cow walking along the dirt road in front of the house. No one got close enough to touch it or interfere with it in any way. We just watched as this glowing animal walked down the road before we were all hurried back into the house. Papa thought someone was playing a joke on us by putting some sort of glow-in-the-dark substance on it or something. But that didn't explain why the chickens and dogs were so worked up and they stopped being that way immediately after the cow had left. I guess there were some boys who lived out there who might have done something like that if they could, and we just never found out. We never had that experience again either. We never saw that glowing cow, and no one ever talked about it with us. Every single one of us saw it though, so we know that whatever it was, it definitely was real. I was used to being left home alone at a very young age. I don't even really remember how young I was when this started, but my parents were both working parents, and I was an only child, so it was just the way things were. There were rules about what I could do while I was home alone, in order to not let people know I was. I always followed those rules down to the very letter because I had been doing them since I was so young. They sort of became second nature to me. When I finally had my own children, I had them follow different rules than I had if they were ever home by themselves. My parents always wanted me to make it look like there was no one in the house at all, so I always kept the lights out, the drapes closed, and I didn't answer the phone or door for any reason. I was 11 years old when this event happened that changed my perspective. I don't really remember what day it was exactly. I think it was one of those holidays that I got off school, but my parents still had to work. I was home by myself basically the entire day, and although it was bright early in the morning, around lunchtime, it began to get a little bit dark outside even then. I went out and looked to the window and saw that a huge storm cloud was moving in. I really liked those sorts of days, so I decided to go and fix me a big can of pasta, have my lunch, and watch the storm. While I was sitting there, I watched the lightning and listened to the thunder as it was getting closer and closer to the storm hitting. Normally, I would not be looking out the window while I was home by myself. It was one of those rules that I was generally pretty good about following. However, I loved storm watching so much that I just always had to watch them when they began rolling in, so that was the only rule I did occasionally break. Soon, the rain started to fall pretty damn hard, and the storm was out in full force. I can almost recall it like it was yesterday. It's so clear in my mind. The wind was pummeling the trees pretty hard. I even saw some objects being blown around in the wind too. At one point, a medium-sized trash can went soaring down the streets. Soon though, I saw the strangest thing. There was a man in a black raincoat or perhaps a trench coat, and he was simply walking down the street. I found this really weird because it was raining so hard and the wind was blowing fiercely too, not to mention just how dark it was outside now. I could only imagine he absolutely had to be out there for some reason because no one in their right mind would be walking around in that weather. I was so curious that I kept watching this guy as he was coming closer to the part of the street my home was on. I couldn't really make out any of his features because he was wearing a hat covering his face too. Another odd thing is that he wasn't carrying an umbrella with him, which seemed really weird given the circumstances. I did notice though that he kept looking from side to side as he walked down the street. It looked as if he was searching for something, like maybe he was looking for a certain address perhaps. While he was walking by my house, he turned his head and looked over in my general direction. When he did, I tried my best to hide myself behind the drapes, hoping he hadn't seen me. I knew that I should have kept myself hidden there, but I was too curious about him. I just had to look again. When I looked back out, I noticed the guy looked like he had hurt himself or something. He was crouched over, and it looked like he was holding his leg. There was a lot of debris blowing down the street, so I figured he must have gotten hit by a stray object. Now I was filled with a really bad choice. Normally when I was home alone, I would keep the fact I was there alone a secret. But what if this guy had been seriously hurt by whatever had just struck him? He might need an ambulance or something. Plus, I figured he may have already seen me when he looked over at the house. Maybe he'd already figured out someone was there. I decided to go out and ask the guy if I needed to call an ambulance or something for him. It was still the middle of the day, so I figured it would be safe doing so. and I grabbed my umbrella and slipped my shoes on. I walked outside, closed the door behind me, and very carefully walked out to where the guy was kneeling. I couldn't hear much of anything over the wind and storm, so I had no idea if he was moaning or groaning in pain or saying anything at all. I walked up to him with the umbrella and put my hand out to tap him on the shoulder. Before I could actually do that, though, he quickly lunged up at me and grabbed me by the arm. He stood up, and I realized he was not hurt at all. He must have seen me in the window of the dark house and assumed I was home alone. Pretended to hurt himself so I would go out and try to help, and stupidly I did. I began struggling, trying to get away from him, but I was just an 11-year-old kid who had no chance of overpowering a man of this size. I began desperately screaming for help, hoping that someone would hear me since it was a day off from school. Then, though, something really weird happened. I heard this really loud barking sound and watched as out of nowhere, a German shepherd came sprinting across the street. It ran right up to the guy and bit him hard on the ankle. The man cried out when it happened and let go of me. I turned and ran into the house, slipping only once. I made it inside and locked all the doors and windows. I looked out the window quickly and noticed something else. There was a light on and a door was open on one of the houses that was across the street from me. Someone was standing in the doorway. I suppose it was a person who sicked the dog on the guy. The guy, in the meantime, was trying his very best to get away from that dog, but not having a good go of it. He was eventually able to free himself and run down the street. This was not before the police car sirens could be heard well on their way, though. Turned out the lady who lived across the street was a teacher and had work off that day. She had heard me scream when the guy grabbed me, so she unleashed her dog on him. She may very well have saved my life that day. I was a bit of a freaked out kid when I was really young. Being an only child, I spent quite a lot of nights alone in my room, being scared of what was under the bed or what was in the closet or whatever. My family lived in an old house too, so it settled and creaked and moaned quite a bit at night. While I was young, I was really scared of all these noises in the dark. My parents would always explain to me that it was just the house and there was nothing at all to worry about. When I started to get older, I became really used to it. I also became a little desensitized to scary things too. When I was really younger, I would watch a lot of scary movies and sometimes get really freaked out. I would turn off the light by the door and then run and jump into my bed. I was scared for quite a while that something would grab my leg if I went too slowly. But around the time I was 13 years old, I stopped being scared of things like that. I just sort of got used to the dark eventually, and it didn't scare me much at all. One thing though is that my parents wouldn't leave me home by myself at all when I was younger. If they were going somewhere, I would be going with them. If for some reason I could not go with them, I would be spending my time at a friend's house instead. This pretty much continued for most of my young life, all the way up until I was in my early teens. That was when my parents decided I was finally mature enough to begin staying home by myself. I guess the first time I stayed home by myself overnight, I can admit a lot of those childhood fears resurfaced a bit. I began to get creeped out by all the noises I had since grown accustomed to, and I started getting a little bit worried about things being under the bed or in the closet once again. It really wasn't that bad though, and it didn't last too long either. I was eventually just as accustomed to it when my parents were not home as much as I was when they had been home. When I was around 15, my parents were going to be away for an entire evening. They wouldn't be back until the following late morning. It was very cool for me because it was a Friday night, so I didn't have anything to do until the next morning. I'm not going to be cliché here. I didn't keep up all night watching horror movies or anything like that. I actually didn't become a fan of horror at all until recent years. Back then, I just kinda liked reading, so after I had eaten, brushed my teeth, and everything like that, I went into my bedroom and settled in to read a good book. As usual, I began to hear a bunch of noises in the house, but I didn't let them bother me this time. After all, it was just the house settling. Hearing what sounded like people walking around or things on the stairs and stuff like that was nothing out of the ordinary. It didn't really distract me at all from any of my reading. It was after a while I was reading, though, that I began to see these flashes outside the window. I didn't normally follow the weather back then, so I had no idea a storm had been rolling in. Normally, I didn't spend a lot of time home by myself either when there was a storm, so I was a bit more freaked out than I normally would have been. Still though, I was not going to let this get me down. I had a good book going and I was having a very good read. What did pull me out of my book eventually though, was a sound unlike anything I had ever heard before. It sounded like a freight train was running through the neighborhood. I jumped up and ran over to the window to look outside. I didn't see whatever it was that was making the noise. In that moment, I flipped on the television in my bedroom to realize that there was a tornado warning in the area. I was freaked out. I assumed this must be the noise I was hearing. But as loud as this noise was, I calmed down and realized it couldn't have been that close, or the TV would not be working still. I decided maybe it was time to take shelter down in the basement though. I went out into the hallway over to the stairs. I was walking around in the dark, like I told you I was used to doing. I wasn't going to go down the stairs in the dark though. I flipped the switch on to turn the light at the bottom of the stairs. When the light came on, the strangest thing happened. I heard someone exclaim something from in the living room. "Holy shit!" or something like that. I stopped at the top of the stairs. Despite the noise of the storm, I was able to hear someone was actually down in my living room and must have sprinted out of the room. For the first time really being scared, I turned around and went back to my bedroom. I went in and locked the door. I didn't have a phone in my room though, so I couldn't call 911 or anything. All I could do was hide in my closet and hunker down in there until the storm began dying down. I'm not sure how long I stayed in there in the end. Obviously, the tornado did not hit my house, and it calmed down long before I even considered coming out. But I kept hearing the noises of the storm, mixed with the noises of the house, and I couldn't tell whether it was innocuous or whether whoever had broken into my home was still there making these sounds. It was much later when I finally got brave enough to come out again. When I did, I crept through that house, trying to see what was going on. It was scary as hell going downstairs, but I was able to manage to do it. I guess I shouldn't have been surprised to not find anyone inside the house. I mean, they seemed quite alarmed when the light came on and probably had been gone ever since then, but there were many clear signs of a break-in inside the house downstairs. This story is perhaps more uncomfortable than it is necessarily scary. Growing up, and probably all the way through my 20s, I believed in a lot of metaphysical things. I believed in ghosts, psychics, tarot cards, you name it. I don't really believe in any of that nowadays, but when I was younger, you couldn't convince me these things didn't exist. When I was 26 though, I had a really horrible experience. It was a bunch of drama that I really don't want to go too deep into. However, as I tried to move past it, I began seeing that it affected the rest of my life pretty badly. Basically, an ex of mine was very fascinated with a guy who liked me, so they spread some rumors and lies about the guy in order to keep me away from him so my ex could try and have him instead. It all backfired when, out of concern, I told the guy who liked me what had been said. He didn't believe me and I got completely ostracized from my entire group of friends. It was terrible. I tried to move on and meet some new people, however, that was not exactly going very easily. I met some new guys and went on some dates, but everything seemed to always end in a very similar way. My brain at the time noticed these patterns and tried to put a story behind them. I started to genuinely believe I was cursed or something similar. So of course, what do you do when you're cursed? I decided to go see a psychic. I didn't know what to expect because I had never really been to one before. I myself was a reader of tarot cards though, so I pretty much knew what all the cards stood for, how to lay them out, and how to read them as well. I don't know the exact ethnicity of the old fortune teller I eventually went to, but she was very old, and she had a very strong accent as well of some sort. I went in and made a pretty stupid mistake right off the bat. I told her everything that had been going on in my life, and how things had been really bad. I wondered if she could tell me why things were going so badly, and what I could do in order to make them go right again. Well, obviously, in hindsight, my first mistake was giving her way too much information. She began reading my tarot cards, and while she did, I realized she was completely making everything up as she went along, so it would fit the story I'd told her. Of course, I felt really bad and realized she was not going to try and help me in any way. She told me, though, that there were two people who were really against me, and they had put a sort of spell on me. She told me she couldn't reveal who they were just yet, but she could cast a counter spell or something that would be able to revert this curse. She went into this speech about all these candles she would have to burn that would cost $750 to do. Of course, she would have done it for free, she claimed, if it wasn't for those oh-so-special candles. There was no way I was going to do that, of course. I mean, I had simply gone there for a psychic reading. I didn't have $750 to just throw away. There was something about this woman, though, that kept me from just saying no and going. This weird, overbearing presence that I was sort of intimidated by. Eventually, after a long bit of uncomfortability, I was able to finally get away by telling her I had the money stored at home and would return with it later. I don't think she believed me, but I still managed to get out and succeeded. So what makes this story uncomfortable then? Not long after, I got a message from the guy I told you about earlier. He told me he was dabbling a bit in the occult at the time and was so upset by what had happened, he went to a psychic and had them put a curse on me. He apologized profusely for that. I asked him about the psychic he went to, and he told me it happened to be the very same woman I had gone to see as well. Apparently, when she heard my story, she was well aware I was the person that guy had wanted to put the curse on. For a moment, I genuinely believed in curses, but I guess it was just a scam and she was trying to fleece me out of money or something.